How are voting systems currently handled in the U.S.? How many vendors are there?
So the nature of election systems in the United States today is proprietary, generally speaking. There are about 3 vendors left. I mean, the fact of the matter is, as we speak today, 88% of the nation's voting systems are controlled by 2 vendors. One vendor has over 75% of that market share. So we've seen a great consolidation over the past 8 years of a market that is incredibly dysfunctional and malformed to begin with, which is giving rise to a disincentive to innovate, terrible cost structures. There's no money for municipalities to purchase new systems, so it's very dysfunctional. And that space is controlled by these 3 vendors. ES&S is one of them. Dominion now, which has acquired Sequoia, and some of the assets of the ES&S merger with Diebold. And then Hart is probably the smallest one of the 3 remaining. And quite frankly, their strategy for innovation is a discussion of spare parts.
So what is the Trust the Vote project?
So the Trust the Vote project of the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation is a project that began 4 years ago, quite by accident in the course of a discussion in a venture capital firm that I was working with about dysfunctional and malformed markets. This was November of 2006. We were just watching the meltdown in Ohio again, and as a sort of a whiteboard exercise to some interns who were looking at the process of due diligence, looking at market opportunities, we said, well, let's examine a market that's malformed and dysfunctional. Elections, the voting systems industry seemed like, well, here's a good one. Let's take a look at this. One thing led to another, and we discovered a market that was very seriously in trouble. And no amount of innovation and no amount of blowing it up with new things is going to make it work, because the fact of the matter is there's not a big business to be had there. It's a horrible business to be in, right? You don't have customers with a lot of money. The vendors have no incentive to really invest in making great innovative steps forward to improve these voting systems, because no one's going to pay for that. So this thing festers amongst itself. And we said, this may be a place where we are speaking about something so important, so critical to literally the infrastructure of our democracy, that you can't privatize it. And remember, in 2002, the Help America Vote Act did exactly that. It effectively created a number of things, such as the Elections Assistance Commission, in efforts to bring about a better solution after the debacle of 2000. But it became the Full Employment Act for anyone who wanted to build a voting machine. And there were only a couple at the time, Diebold being one of them, that were really in a good position to do that. Well, that gave rise to machines that were thrown together at the lowest possible cost, so we ended up with commodity operating systems on commodity hardware with black box applications put on top, and the phrase, "Trust us, it works." Well, we need transparency. In fact, the 4 legs of integrity mean that we need accuracy, we need transparency, we need trust, and we need security. And the only way to achieve those things is to treat voting systems in America like critical democracy infrastructure. And that gave rise to this notion that this may be a perfect opportunity for an open source movement to examine that entire ballot ecosystem. The Trust the Vote project does exactly that. We are examining the entire ballot ecosystem. And what I think is kind of cool about this project is that our backers and our trustees and the core team said, let's start with a clean slate. So we have no legacy, we have no incumbency. If we were going to start from the ground up and do it right, what would that technology framework look like? And that's what the Trust the Vote project is actually building. Now, it turns out that the open source project as an open source effort is a little different than going out and building, say, a web browser or a blogging platform or an operating system. And this is because we could go off and build a bunch of cool things in the Valley and tell the world, boy, you should try it and use it, and if you like it, that's great, use it and tell us how to improve it. But voting systems are very fault-tolerant device systems that require things like federal certification, in some cases state certification. They're serious business, and they require a certain amount of operational continuity around the project. So we couldn't just sort of build this like a browser or build this like Linux. So we created a core team, and the Trust the Vote project has a core team, and we're modeled after the Mozilla Foundation to a large extent. We do a lot of work with them, we have a lot of interaction, cross-pollination, and as you know from Mozilla, there's a core team that sort of shepherds that project and keeps it going. Around that are contributors, some volunteer, some paid, some academic, who are contributing pieces into the project, and the core team keeps that operational continuity progressing. The real key here, and what makes this project, gives this project the legs, I think, that it has acquired the past 4 years, is that we realize we don't know everything there is to know about building voting systems, let alone the processes of elections. Remember, it's highly distributed. Every state, every county, every municipality has their own way of doing things. So one size does not fit all. So what we had to do was build a framework. We're still in the process of it. But we're building a framework that means that it can be adapted and adopted. Pieces can be plugged in as needed to do certain things that are local and particular to the state of, say, Kentucky versus Tennessee versus California. This framework then has to be driven by real specifications and real requirements. This is what we did. We started traveling the country and we recruited now over 200 stakeholders in a community called the stakeholder community, comprised of elections officials and elections experts from around the country, the very same people who make the decisions about what to buy and what to implement and what to stand up. They are driving our requirements and specifications, so we're working with real data about what we need to build. And then we are building this new framework. It's highly distributed, it's highly componentized, and it's very different from the monolithic legacy systems that exist out there. Now, it has some challenges. It requires us to work with NIST to rethink the certification model. Their certification model is predicated on one stack of a monolithic system, end to end. We're saying that process is expensive, it's time-consuming, it can take up to 2 years to get a system certified. In fact, part of the problem the legacy vendors have is that sometimes the day that their system has been certified, they also get the revocation letter. Reason? The very hardware that they began the process on 2 years ago is no longer being made. So the system is obsoleted the day it becomes official. So we said you have to componentize this system and make it a framework that we can plug the pieces in and let each piece be certified so we can have a much shorter cycle time to getting certification. Point is, this project is complex. It has a lot of moving parts. We need a lot of help in many areas, but it's not just something that you can just turn everybody loose and say, go start cutting code. It does require some structure and some sequence and some organization to it. But the best news is that we think we actually have an opportunity here. We're at the tipping point now of building stuff that elections jurisdictions are agreeing to implement. You heard this morning the District of Columbia has already chosen to begin implementing parts of our framework, the state of Virginia, and 8 or 9 other states now are seriously considering how this may help them. Remember, for them, the alternative is fairly bleak. To continue using the 2 or 3 legacy vendors that are out there, engaging in multi-year service and support agreements where innovation is a discussion of a guarantee of spare parts.
So, as things are beginning to be adopted now, and obviously an enormous amount of work has gone into this, and it's a variation on what we traditionally think of as open source, how, once implementation happens, how will open source improve the voting system?
So open source has 2 or 3 different ways of innovating, if you will, election systems as they stand today. First and foremost is transparency. This is an incredible challenge for the way elections are run in the United States. On the one hand, we need to ensure that there is absolute anonymity of the vote. On the other hand, we need to ensure that the ballot is actually counted as cast. So there's some challenges in creating a system that's sufficiently transparent that enables anyone to look at it. It's audit ready, it's verifiable, people know that there's no black box, we're now at glass box. The second area that it innovates in is in cost. And one of the things that we wanted to do, harking back to my sort of venture capital roots, was to figure out how to reinvent this industry, to invigorate it with some health and some agility and some aspirations to do better. What we realized was there's this tremendous barrier to entry called the federal certification process. There's also like a dozen state certification processes as well. That's a barrier to entry. Any new company who wants to come in and get in that business to make and deliver voting systems is going to have to invest $6 to $8 million in that process. It's almost like getting a drug approved through the Federal Drug Administration. Not probably as bad, but the complexity is certainly there. The second problem is that you have these legacy vendors who get in with these contracts for proprietary systems that are basically predicated on annuity. Pay me my service money, I'll do as little as I need to keep those systems running, and away we'll go. We said, how can we bring new life into this? We said, well, what if We did all the heavy lifting of the research and development to build a reference implementation of the technology stack that's necessary. Built it so that commodity hardware can run it. Now, systems integrators, a new breed of vendor, can come into the marketplace, take the public license to our technology, acquire the hardware, integrate the two, and stand it up on behalf of the elections jurisdiction. Now, the cost has been dramatically reduced because the elections jurisdiction is putting out an RFP or RFQ to hire a vendor who's essentially a systems integrator to come in and stand up a system because they've selected this open source stack as the baseline software technology. Now you don't have those expensive software licenses on top of integrated hardware and everything else. You're focusing on the systems integration. The good news is there are a host of vendors across the country in the systems integration business of all sizes. And we're talking with integrators now to the size of Credence in Virginia, which is a very focused group that does nothing but specialized government information systems, all the way up to folks at EDS and IBM Global Systems who see the opportunity to take this stack, put the necessary hardware under it, and then stand it up. And by the way, they already have a substantial federal systems or state systems business unit to do that. Now we've opened the floodgates to have a whole new level of competition in there and a whole new category of players. This means, of course, that the foundation is taking on the responsibility to get that baseline technology certified so that we eliminate that huge barrier to entry. So I think changing the cost dynamics there, changing the transparency dynamics there are two things. And third, I think we now really open the opportunity for innovation. We have been introducing innovations into the system because we don't have that legacy, right? We're starting from the ground up. We've looked at the data layer under XML. We've looked at a brand new sort of really hardened, reduced stack for Linux. We have applications running on top of that, but the framework allows other people to come write services to it. And this is what's interesting about that. Going back to that transparency argument, one of the things that we really want to be able to do is get better information out of how elections perform in this country, more accurate data. Well, the ability to get that data, not data that tells you how people voted, but data that tells you at a more redacted scale, the demographics, how many people are participating, how effectively are the polling places working, what are the wait times, how many provisional ballots did we have, how many ballots seem to be in discrepancy. All that data can now be mined through the system because that whole API is exposed, that data layer is exposed, and now we have the ability to plug in audit mechanisms that never before have been available. So transparency, cost, and what I like to call auditability is what open source brings to this critical democracy infrastructure.
That's a pretty big overhaul. That's a pretty big change. So last question I have for you, and I know it's a charged one. Will online voting ever be viable?
You know, it's funny because there is so much to fix with regards to restoring trust in the use of computers in elections. I don't think most people understand what role computers have in the process of casting and counting ballots. Let's not even talk about the transport layer for just a moment.
Sure.
Okay, let's just talk about that whole infrastructure, right? America has over 140 million potential votes to count in a major national election where there's a lot at stake. There are folks out there who believe that every single ballot should be counted by hand with people supervising it.
Sure.
The problem in America is we have a unique aspect of our democracy that's not found in other countries. And that is that on the 20th of January or thereabouts, there has to be an orderly transition of power, which means we have got to have this election settled for certain and certified in a certain time given, right? So there are no do-overs.
Right.
There's no opportunity to say, well, let's try it again. As a result, you have machines in the process, and we're working hard to fix those. But of course, the transport layer becomes a question all the time because we live in a digital age where people are highly mobile, they're distributed. A really good aspect of this is all of our overseas voters. There are nearly 3 million Americans who are overseas in the military and stationed overseas as expats who are working on behalf of this country and can't get home to vote.
Right.
So we have this distance balloting problem that we have to address. The problem, of course, is that's a slippery slope because if I can allow a military to vote from the back hills of Kandahar, why can't I allow you to vote when a volcano grounded your airplane and you can't get home in time? Wouldn't you have the same prospect of being disenfranchised? Those are policy arguments that we're not in a position to address. What we can say is that it is foolhardy to assume that the cloud of the internet has darkened the doorsteps of so many aspects of society that somehow it's not going to darken the doorstep of election systems and voting.
Right.
It is. It already has. The question is how to do so responsibly. And it becomes one of, well, can I vote from my iPhone? Will I ever be able to vote from my iPad? Will this ever be viable for us? Online voting is already happening around the world. But the reason it's happening in countries other than the United States is threefold. Number one, it requires a national ID system. Number two, it requires a nationalized election system. And number three, it requires the ability for people to trust their government to do this. But it requires, the third one really is, it requires a setting where vote by mail has become accepted as the norm. Well, we are the only democracy in the world, frankly, that has this huge distributed system, very balkanized. We push the decisions about how elections are run down to the lowest level. County level, precinct level, rolled up to states, and then the government. There is no federal election system in this country. We also know that the notion of a national ID card, even though I carry my passport, is not met without provocation and controversy. So two of the ingredients that we need aren't in place, and I'm not sure they're ever going to be in place.
Right.
The third one, vote by mail, is something that has been increasingly happening and occurring, and that gives rise to, well, if it can happen through the U.S. Postal Service, why can't it happen through a packet switch network? That's a topic for another whole discussion. Summarily put, there are some very difficult challenges with security and privacy using the internet to transport a ballot. People will always say, well, wait a minute, I can bank online. Why can't I vote online? It goes like this. When I bank online, I have to have the ability to support something called non-repudiation. I have to know for certain that you are the person who authorized that transaction, you assented to that transaction, and in fact, you did do that transaction. But think about elections for a moment. It's very different. First, I have to be able to authenticate that you are exactly who you say you are and that you're registered to vote and you're entitled to cast a ballot. Then, I have to make absolutely certain that it is impossible, that there is no way you can ever prove to anyone how you cast that ballot. So I have to decouple the ballot from the person who cast it. Now, it doesn't take very much thought to think about, how does the internet work, the core versus the edge, and whether or not there's opportunities for compromise at either end, regardless of how secure the transport layer is itself. And whether or not I can't, through some back annotation or some reverse engineering, figure out who cast that ballot. As a result, will we ever be able to vote online? I think there will be a category of individuals who have what we call the exigent circumstance, that soldier in Kandahar, who may have no choice. And it's better than using a fax or email. But for widespread use of online voting in this country, I think it is many years off, and I think it's going to require changes that have nothing to do with technology, but everything to do with culture, process, and politics.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming by.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you.